Let's talk about an important challenge for anyone who is thinking about the future of the energy industry or the future of climate change. So we can call this the energy access and climate challenge. The basic problem is that one, the world is going to need a lot more energy in the future, and we'll talk about that. Most of the world uses just a tiny fraction of the amount of electricity that's used in the richest countries, particularly countries like the United States. So as the world gets richer, it's going to need more electricity for transportation, heating and cooling, et cetera. And it will need energy for all of the things that we use energy for in wealthy countries. At the same time, of course, we're facing the challenge of climate change. And one way you can think about that challenge is, what have countries said they're going to do to address climate change, and what are countries actually doing, and what are we on track for in terms of cutting our climate emissions. And this is a chart that shows those different things. So you can see here the chart, and I always want you to pay attention to when it stops being measurements and when it starts being projections. Here we can see the measurements in that black line leading up to about 2017. And then after that, we can see different scenarios, different projections. And the projections that leads to the highest carbon emissions, the highest pathway on this chart, is the baseline. And we can see that under that baseline scenario, we're looking at about 4.5 degrees warmer as a world. So the world is already about a degree warmer than it was pre-industrial. And so you're talking about, about 3.5 degrees more under that scenario. Now, of course, the world has made a number of promises about how it's going to address climate change. And by that, I mean the political leaders of our different countries. And so if you ask, what has the world said it will do on climate change? Well, nearly every country in the world has said that they are going to try to keep climate change under 2 degrees total. And that you can see in this kind of pea green trajectory that would keep things below 2 degrees Celsius, so less than another degree of warming. And that has been the promise that most countries have made. Now, on the other hand, you could look at, well, what have countries done to implement that? They say they're going to keep things to 2 degrees warming, but what have they actually done? Well, there's a couple ways you could look at that. One is you could look at the policies that they put in place, which are in presents this trajectory in blue here that says current policies. And there you can see that current policy is almost like the actual baseline that we're currently on. Yes, countries have agreed to cut their emissions somewhat. They have policies for that, but they are not anywhere near keeping the world under 2 degrees warming. In fact, if we look at that, that would get things to about 3.5 degrees. Okay, well, one argument that we should be more optimistic than that is that countries have actually pledged that they're going to do more. So although they haven't adopted policies yet, they've said, well, we will adopt policies in the future that is going to cut our carbon emissions and then cut global climate change more. And that's what these pledges indicate, and these independently determined national commitments. You can see that here, and that would keep things to about 2.5 degrees. So a little bit close to 2 degrees, but not quite hitting that target. And then you see even more ambitious targets like keeping things to 1.5 degrees. Now, when we think about that as just as students or as academics, maybe we can say, well, we don't know what's going to happen. There's all these different possibilities, and I guess we'll see. But of course, for a number of actors, these are really crucial decisions because imagine that you're an investor and you are thinking about investing in a piece of infrastructure that will work if we keep things to 2 degrees, but won't work if we keep things to 4 degrees. Or imagine that you're an investor in some kind of fossil fuel project. Now, maybe you're thinking about sinking $10 billion into a large oil project. And maybe that makes a lot of sense because you expect future demand for oil and a lot of future demand for oil because you believe things will basically follow this baseline in which we have continued increases in carbon emissions. Or maybe you say, you know what, this will be fine under current policies as well because the world will still need oil under those policies. But you think, well, if they kept things to 1.5 degrees, that would be a very different scenario. And we can see that these trajectories diverge almost immediately. So you have those green and pea green trajectories dropping from now, whereas what countries have pledged to do, they've said, well, we're going to start cutting emissions really in about 10 years. Their policies, we wouldn't hit a peak until about 2080. So we would have another 60 years. So the real question is, how quickly is the world going to start moving off of fossil fuels? And that's not just a theoretically interesting question. For people who are investing in fossil fuels, they need to make the decision. And it's very important because if it turns out we do have this high demand for fossil fuels in the future, they'll be very expensive unless people have been, in the meantime, making investments in them. So there is an important decision to make for investors every day on which trajectory are we really on. Here's a couple ways to think about that problem. So, first of all, it's important to understand that energy use around the world is tiny compared with what it is in wealthy countries like the United States. So, what I think you can see here is that if you had energy use in India, that is going to be just a couple percentage points of what you would have in the United States, about 3%, in Nigeria, less than 2%. And so, what does that mean in practice? Well, in a country like Nigeria, the average household would use less electricity than even an efficient fridge. So, if imagine that, of course, the whole developing world is going to want not only refrigerators, but lighting, probably air conditioning, heating, all of the TV, all of the Wi-Fi, all the things that we associate with a modern developed economy. And you can think, okay, there's going to be a massive demand for energy use across the world. Now, of course, it would be possible in theory to meet that energy demand to a certain extent with sources that would not have carbon emissions. So we could have, a huge build out of nuclear power plants. We could have, if we figured out a way to do this, we could have solar and wind plus batteries. It might be hard to have the kind of reliable electricity that we have in the developed world if you only went that way. But over time, we might develop new technologies that make that more possible as a realistic option to bring the entire world to the level of energy use that's enjoyed in the wealthy world. With that said, in the meantime, there is this incredible demand, growing demand for energy across the world. And until we replace all of our energy sources with zero carbon energy, and that's a while off, there will be increasing demand for fossil fuels, natural gas to run power plants to support increased electricity use, oil for transport, principally cars, but of course truck transport, increasing flights, etc. So there's an incredible demand for more energy across the world. And so on the one hand, that is an important consideration. On the other hand, of course, we're thinking about, well, how do we try to limit our carbon emissions to address climate change? The important thing to understand there is there are big, important trade-offs. So here is a chart that is taken from William Nordhaus, who just won the Nobel Prize for his work on the costs of climate change. And in his Nobel speech, he presented this chart and explained his work on two very important things. One is the cost that climate change will impose on all of us, because as the oceans rise, as temperatures change, as we have to, move to different crops, or change our infrastructure or harden it against the things that climate change are bringing, that's going to impose costs on all of us, and those costs are extremely significant. So you see them in these green bars on this chart. And so effectively, if we did nothing on climate change, we're looking at a cost, and these are very rough estimates, and there's disagreement on these estimates, it's important to say, but let's say about $25 trillion. So about $25 trillion, that's a little bit over $3,000 per man, woman, and child in the world, right? That's a very significant cost imposed on all of us by these future damages from climate change. The second thing that Nordhaus looks at is what would be the cost of stopping climate change? Because as we discussed, it's going to cost a lot of money to stop climate change, because what that means is switching from the sources we currently rely on, like gasoline and oil for transport, like coal, natural gas, to some extent oil for electricity, and switching to newer sources of energy that can be substantially more expensive, particularly when you consider that you're having to shut down existing plants and move to new ones. And again, these numbers are just his numbers. He'd be the first to say they're very approximate, and there's disagreement on these numbers. But let's take it as potential ballpark. That's what this chart presents in red. And what I want you to see here is that those costs are also very significant. So he's considering different scenarios, and I want you to focus on this one that's second from right. That second from right one is if the world keeps its promise to keep things to 2 degrees of warming Celsius. That's about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And what he shows is that the cost of that would be huge. In fact, about $35 trillion. So in fact, the cost of keeping climate change to just 2 degrees would actually be larger than the cost of doing nothing at all. In other words, the cost that climate change would impose if we did nothing at all. And so what he shows is if it's about 36 trillion, so about $5,000 per man, woman, and child in the world. Now, he'd be the first to say maybe that's not exactly right, but what that makes clear is we have to think very carefully about these costs imposed by climate change, because they're huge, but also the costs imposed by trying to limit climate change. They can be even bigger in some circumstances. He tries to do a rough estimate of how do we minimize the cost of both of these things. That's this optimal path. So that would be not keeping things to 2 degrees Celsius, imposing some cost to switch away from fossil fuels. So here it's a cost less than $10 trillion, right? That's in red. And that's not going to stop the harm from climate change. You can see that in green, you still have a significant harm from climate change, about $15 trillion, so about $2,000 per man, woman, and child in the world. But it saves about $10 trillion for the entire world. So it has significant benefits. And that's based on his estimates of how do you strike that balance between paying money to limit climate change and uh, and reducing those harms from climate change. Now that, of course, because these numbers are very approximate, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. Some people will say it's actually going to be cheaper than this to address climate change, and so we should cut carbon emissions more. Some people say actually it will be more expensive to cut carbon, and so we shouldn't cut quite as much. So there'll be disagreement about these numbers. Nobody's presenting them as, you know, as unquestionable. The point is simply that when we think about what trajectory the world is going to be on, we're going to have to think about that as what are the costs that we're going to suffer from climate change, and what costs are we willing to pay to avoid that. So then when we look at this chart, you might think, okay, so where are we really going to end up? You know, are we going to keep it to the 2 degrees, that sort of pea green scenario? If so, it's probably going to cost us a lot to do that. Maybe countries won't really be willing to do that given the costs involved. Will they be willing to stick to the pledges that they've made? Well, possibly, although they haven't enacted them in law yet. Will they be willing to stick to their enacted law? Well, hopefully, and maybe they'll even strengthen them. So maybe we'll end up somewhere between the pledges and the current policies. Some people might be skeptical that countries will really stick with their current policies. Note that they only really would peak emissions, 60 years from now, right? So are countries really going to stand by those policies when they start to require hard cuts to emissions? That's another question. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now in terms of the future trajectory of carbon emissions. Are they going to keep going up, or are we going to quickly peak them and come down? So one just small component of this question is, what's going to happen with oil demand in the world? Oil demand has risen for about 120 years, since the start of the modern oil industry. 1901, you got the Spindletop find in Texas. You've had gradually rising demand for oil. Now, there have been some bumps in the road. You can see here that when oil prices got very high in the 70s, we cut oil use globally for a while. And there's been some downturns in recessions, but generally oil demand has kept rising. In 2019, we reached 100 million barrels a day of oil consumption, a good round number. But then, of course, in the pandemic in 2020, we had a big fall in oil demand. And even though oil demand has always risen in the past, some people at that point said, you know what? I think oil demand has finally peaked. We're going to have falling oil demand from this period. And so there were a number of analyses, like the one that I'm showing you here, that said, look, going forward, things are never going to hit the peak oil demand that we had just before the pandemic hit. Either they're just going to stagnate and fall gradually, or because we have increasing regulation of carbon emissions, they're going to fall off rapidly. So in other words, the argument was, this time it's different. Yes, every time in the past, oil demand has continued to rise as economic growth has meant more and more people around the world look to drive cars. But this time it's really different. This time, really oil demand is going to fall off. And of course, that would be a huge deal for oil companies around the world, because those oil companies around the world are making investments often on the assumption that people in the future will continue to want to use a lot of oil. And people will still be using some oil, even if oil use peak tomorrow. But of course, on the margin, when you're thinking about how much you want to invest in new oil development, it makes a big difference if you expect a lot of people to, more and more people to be using oil in the future, or oil demand to fall. So People thought this time was different. Is it different? Well, so far, probably not. So this is the most recent outlook on oil demand from the US Energy Information Administration, just from August 2021. And what you can see here is that oil demand pretty quickly jumped back up. It's still not to where it was at the start of the pandemic, although it's almost there. But the expectation is that by the end of next year, oil demand will have hit an all-time high. So oil will, just like in the past, have fallen, but then rise, continue to rise as more and more people around the world demand oil. If that's the case, of course, that means the oil companies around the world will be looking to invest in new places to find more oil production to meet that increasing demand. So that's the important question going forward. Will it continue to rise or not? So one perspective is no, oil demand is going to fall off from now on because we are going to move away from fossil fuels rapidly to meet the world's promises to keep things to 2 degrees. Another perspective is that for the most part, the world just adds new energy sources. So here's a projection from the US Energy Information Administration that says, yeah, if you look at all these energy sources going forward, we're probably going to be using more of all of them because we have all these people around the world looking to live in the same way that rich countries enjoy as the economy grows around the world, cars, AC, all of the things that we enjoy. And so you will see a rise in petroleum use all the way out to 2050. You see that in brown here. Now, if you're looking for good news on the environmental front, there will be more use of renewables. In fact, because of the falling cost of solar and wind and our increasing deployment of those resources, they will be the #1 source of energy. They'll be rising more rapidly than any other source. They'll be the #1 source within 25 years. So, that's the good news. But in terms of climate, all of those sources, natural gas and blue here continues to rise. Even coal, falling now in terms of its use, will continue to rise as those billions around the world demand more energy. Now, this isn't inconsistent with action on climate change. If we're able to figure out ways to capture the carbon emissions from our fossil fuel use, or if we're able to figure out ways to pull carbon out of the air, but certainly it would be a challenge in terms of meeting some of those near-term goals of limiting warming. So when you think about this question of really what's going to happen in the future, I think it's important to understand both that it's very hard to understand the future, that if you look at the promises of countries versus the past development of resources and sort of the history of increasing use of energy, sometimes those will lead you to very different places. And it's also important to remember that as hard as it is to make any predictions about the future, the people that are making investments in these multi-billion-dollar projects around the world have to make predictions. They have no choice. They have to say, you know what? I think it's worth investing $30 billion in this new liquefied natural gas facility because I see increasing demand for natural gas around the world. So these questions, although very difficult and impossible to predict with any precision, are nonetheless extremely important, and people are making million and billion dollar decisions about them every day.